Welcome to Sleep Gently, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favourite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep, to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. The afternoon post brought a letter that changed everything. Dr. James Hartley held it in his hands for a long moment before breaking the seal, somehow knowing that what lay within would alter the careful equilibrium of his life. Outside his consulting room window, snow had begun to fall over the streets of London, early for November but not unprecedented. The flakes drifted past the glass in that particular silence that snow brings, muffling the usual cacophony of the city. He unfolded the letter and read, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock to something more complex. The letter was from a solicitor in Yorkshire, informing him that his elder brother Edward had died 3 weeks prior. Edward, whom he had not seen in 20 years. Edward, with whom he had parted in anger over matters that now seemed trivial from the distance of 2 decades. The letter went on to explain that Edward had left his estate, a manor house called Ashwood Hall, to James, but there was a condition. James must travel to Yorkshire before the end of November, must stay at Ashwood Hall for at least 1 week, and must read a series of documents Edward had left for him. Only then would the inheritance be complete. James set the letter down and stared at it as though it might transform into something less demanding. He had built a successful medical practice in London, had patients depending on him, had a life carefully structured to require nothing from the past. The thought of returning to Yorkshire, to the place where he and Edward had grown up, where their fraternal bond had fractured, filled him with a dread he could not quite name. But the letter was explicit. If he did not fulfil the conditions by month's end, the estate would pass to distant cousins. And despite everything, despite the years of silence and the bitterness of their parting, James found he could not simply dismiss his brother's final request. He called for his assistant, young Dr. Pemberton, and explained that he would need to be away for at least 2 weeks. Pemberton, eager and capable, assured him that the practice would be managed competently in his absence. And so, with a sense of moving towards something inevitable and possibly painful, James made arrangements to travel north. The journey took 2 days, with an overnight stop at a coaching inn in the Midlands. The weather worsened as he travelled, snow falling more heavily, the wind picking up until his carriage struggled through drifts that accumulated faster than they could be cleared. By the time he reached the village nearest Ashwood Hall, afternoon was fading into an early winter dusk, and the landscape had become a monotone study in white and grey. Ashwood Hall stood at the end of a long drive, barely visible through the driving snow. James felt a jolt of recognition as the carriage pulled up to the entrance. The house looked much as he remembered, though perhaps smaller, as childhood places always seemed when revisited in adulthood. Stone walls, mullioned windows, a certain austere dignity that reflected the Yorkshire character. A housekeeper emerged as the carriage stopped, a woman of perhaps 60 with a stern face that softened slightly when she saw him. "Dr. Hartley, I'm Mrs. Brennan, Mr. Edward's housekeeper these past 15 years. He told me you'd be coming, though he wasn't certain you would." James stepped down into the snow, feeling it crunch beneath his boots. I almost didn't. The weather nearly prevented it. Winter comes early here and stays late. Come inside, sir. There's a fire laid in the library and supper will be ready shortly." He followed her into the house, into warmth and the smell of beeswax and old wood. The entrance hall was as he remembered. The same dark panelling, the same staircase rising to the upper floors. But it felt different now, empty in a way that had nothing to do with furniture or decoration. Mrs. Brennan showed him to his room, a chamber on the second floor that he recognised with a start as having been his own in childhood. Someone, Edward presumably, had kept it much as it had been, though with adult furnishings replacing the child-sized pieces he remembered. "Mr. Edward left instructions," Mrs. Brennan said as she lit the lamps. "You're to read the documents in his study at your own pace. There's no rush, though the solicitor did specify the terms about the week's stay. Did my brother suffer at the end?" She paused, her hand on the door. "He did not suffer long, if that's what you're asking. His heart simply stopped one morning. He was sitting at his desk writing. A peaceful end, all things considered. After she left, James stood at the window looking out at the snow-covered grounds. Darkness was falling rapidly, and the wind had picked up, howling around the eaves in a way that made the house feel both besieged and protected. He thought about Edward, dying alone in this house, writing until his heart failed. What had he been writing? The documents mentioned in the will? Supper was served in a small dining room, rather than the grand hall James remembered from childhood. Mrs. Brennan explained that Mr. Edward had preferred the cosier space, especially in winter. James ate alone, the only sounds the clink of silver on china and the wind outside. Afterward he made his way to Edward's study. The room was on the ground floor overlooking the gardens, though the windows now showed only darkness and the reflection of lamplight. A fire had been laid and lit, and the room glowed with warmth. Bookshelves lined the walls, and a large desk dominated the centre, its surface cleared except for a wooden box. James approached the desk slowly, as though the box might contain something dangerous. Perhaps it did. Perhaps the most dangerous things were memories, regrets, words left too long unspoken. He opened the box. Inside lay a series of letters, each in its own envelope, numbered from 1 to 10. Beneath them, a journal bound in worn leather, and beneath that, a single sheet of paper with instructions in Edward's familiar hand. "James, if you are reading this, then you have come. I wasn't certain you would. We parted badly, and I have carried the guilt of that parting for 20 years. These letters are my attempt to explain, to apologize, to perhaps help you understand why I made the choices I did. Read them in order, take your time, and know that despite everything, you are always my brother, and I never stopped caring." James sat heavily in the chair behind the desk. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the first envelope. 20 years of silence, and now this. He almost resented Edward for it, for reaching out from beyond death when reconciliation in life had been possible at any point but never attempted. But he had come this far. He would read. The first letter began with an apology. Edward wrote of their final argument, the bitter words exchanged over their father's will. James had felt slighted by the inheritance, which had favoured Edward as the elder son. He had accused Edward of manipulation, of turning their father against him. Edward had responded with equal anger, and they had parted with words neither could take back. "I should have reached out afterward," Edward wrote, Should have written, should have travelled to London, should have done anything but let pride and hurt keep us apart. But weeks became months, months became years, and the distance seemed too great to bridge. I told myself you were better off without me, that you had built a life that didn't need complications from the past. In truth, I was afraid. Afraid you would reject me. Afraid the damage was too deep to repair. James set the letter down and stared into the fire. He remembered that argument with painful clarity, the sense of betrayal he had felt. But reading Edward's words now, he realised how young they had both been, how the slights that seemed so significant then appeared almost trivial from the perspective of middle age. The second letter, which he read the following morning after a restless night, dealt with what Edward had done with his inheritance. Rather than living lavishly as James had bitterly imagined, Edward had used the money to improve the estate's farms, to provide better housing for tenants, to support the local school. He had lived simply, almost frugally, pouring resources into the land and community. I wanted to prove worthy of Father's trust, Edward explained. I wanted to show that his choice had been right, that I could be a good steward. But I also wanted to prove something to you, even though you weren't there to see it. I wanted to show that I wasn't the grasping elder brother you believed me to be. The snow continued through that second day, and James found himself unable to leave the house even if he had wished to. Mrs. Brennan brought meals and attended to the fires, but otherwise left him, alone with his thoughts and Edward's letters. The third letter was more difficult. It dealt with Edward's own regrets beyond the fraternal breach. He had never married, had remained alone at Ashwood Hall for 2 decades. I told myself I was too busy, that the estate required all my attention. But the truth is that I never found anyone who could make me forget my loneliness, who could fill the gap left by losing you. I know how that sounds, perhaps overly sentimental. But you were my brother, my closest companion for the first 20 years of my life, and losing that connection left a wound that never fully healed. James had to stop reading, overcome by emotion he had kept carefully controlled for years. He moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. The world beyond the house was white and still, pristine in its covering. He thought about his own life in London, his successful practice, his comfortable bachelor existence. He too had never married, had told. Himself he was too devoted to his work. But was that the whole truth? Or had he too been carrying a wound, an emptiness that he had simply learned to ignore? The fourth letter introduced new information. Edward wrote about their childhood, about memories James had forgotten or suppressed. Long summer days exploring the grounds, winter evenings reading by the fire, the 1,000 small moments that made up a shared life. I don't write this to make you sad, Edward explained, but to remind you that before the anger and hurt, there was love, there was brotherhood, and that was real, James, as real as the bitterness that came after. By the 5th day, James had read through the 8th letter. Each one peeled back another layer, revealed another facet of Edward's solitary life, his regrets, his hopes that somehow, someday, they might reconcile. The snow had finally stopped on the 4th day, leaving the world buried under several feet of accumulation, but the roads were impassable, and James found himself genuinely snowbound, trapped in this house with his brother's ghost and the accumulating weight of might-have-beens. The 9th letter was different in tone. It was shorter, written with less careful composition. "I'm dying, James. The doctor tells me my heart is failing. I have perhaps weeks, perhaps months, but not longer, and I find myself thinking not about the estate or my accomplishments, but about you, about the brother I lost through my own pride and cowardice. If you're reading this, then I'm already gone, and it's too late for reconciliation in life, but perhaps not too late for understanding, perhaps not too late for forgiveness. James read this sitting at Edward's desk as afternoon faded into evening. Mrs. Brennan had brought tea, but it sat untouched, growing cold. Outside, the world was turning blue in the twilight, that particular shade of winter dusk that felt both beautiful and melancholy. The 10th and final letter was the hardest to read. Edward wrote about the end, about facing death alone, about the regrets that haunted him as his time ran short. But he also wrote about hope. I hope you will forgive me, James. I hope you will understand that I never stopped loving you, never stopped missing you, never stopped wishing we could go back and choose differently. I hope that by leaving you Ashwood Hall, I can give you something of value, not just property, but perhaps a place to remember, to grieve, to heal. And I hope that somewhere in some way I cannot comprehend, we might meet again, and I might have the chance to say in person what I'm writing now. I'm sorry. I love you. You were always my brother, and that never changed. James folded the letter carefully and placed it back into its envelope. Then he opened Edward's journal. The entries spanned 20 years, a chronicle of seasons, of estate business, of daily life. But threaded through it all were thoughts of James, memories recalled, hopes expressed that they might someday reconcile. One entry, dated 5 years earlier, stopped him. Passed through London today on business. Walked past James's consulting rooms on Harley Street. I stood across the street for an hour, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Finally saw him emerge, speaking with a patient. He looked well, successful. I wanted to call out, to cross the street, to simply say hello. But I stood frozen, all the old fear and shame rising up. In the end, I turned away. Perhaps tomorrow I'll have more courage. Perhaps tomorrow I'll finally reach out. But there had been no tomorrow, or at least not one in which Edward had found that courage. And now it was too late for anything but reading words written to a brother who was no longer there to hear them. James spent the evening sitting in the library, the journal closed on his lap, staring into the fire. Mrs. Brennan brought dinner on a tray, saw his expression, and withdrew quietly. The house settled around him in its winter stillness, the only sounds the occasional crack of settling wood and the soft whisper of snow sliding from the roof. He thought about his own choices, his own pride that had kept him from reaching out. How many times had he thought about writing to Edward? How many times had he composed letters in his mind, only to dismiss them as pointless or too difficult? He had told himself that Edward was the elder brother, that it was Edward's responsibility to make the first move, but that was just another form of pride, another excuse to avoid vulnerability. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. James woke early and dressed, drawn by impulse to explore the house more thoroughly. He wandered through rooms he remembered and rooms that were new, seeing everywhere evidence of Edward's life. Books on agriculture and estate management, paintings of local landscapes, small objects that spoke of a quiet, solitary existence. In the morning room, he found a painting that stopped him. It was a watercolour of two boys, clearly himself and Edward, perhaps aged 8 and 10. They were sitting by the river that ran through the estate, fishing poles in hand, expressions of concentration on their young faces. He didn't remember the painting being made, but he remembered that day, or days like it. The sense of companionship, of shared purpose, even in such a simple activity. Mrs. Brennan found him standing before the painting, his hand raised as if to touch it. "He painted that himself about 10 years ago," she said quietly. "Worked from memory. He said it was one of his happiest recollections. He never mentioned taking up painting in any of the letters. There's much he didn't mention, I expect. He was a private man, kept his feelings close. But I can tell you he thought of you often. Any time someone mentioned London, any time he read news from the city, he'd go quiet after, lost in his thoughts." James turned to her. "Did he ever speak of me?" "Only once to me, directly. I'd asked him, you see, why he never married, never had family around. He said the only family he'd wanted was lost to him, and nothing else seemed worth the effort of building. I told him he was being foolish, that it was never too late to mend fences. He agreed, but said some fences were too broken to mend." "He was wrong," James said softly. "It wouldn't have been too late. Not until it was." The roads were declared passable on the 8th day. A messenger arrived to say that the main route south had been cleared and travel was again possible. James knew he could leave, that he had fulfilled the terms of the will, had stayed his week and read his brother's words. But he found he didn't want to leave. Not yet. There was something unfinished, some process that needed more time. He told Mrs. Brennan he would stay another week, perhaps longer. She nodded as if she'd expected nothing else. He spent those additional days walking the estate despite the cold and the deep snow. He visited the tenants, introduced himself, heard their stories of Edward's fairness and generosity. He toured the farms, saw the improvements Edward had made. He walked the river where they had fished as boys, stood in the places they had played, and slowly something shifted inside him. The anger he had carried for 20 years, the sense of betrayal and hurt, began to feel less like a fresh wound and more like an old scar, something that had shaped him but no longer controlled him. He found himself thinking not about what had been lost, but about what had been, about the years of brotherhood before the break. On his final evening he sat again in Edward's study, the fire burning low, shadows deepening in the corners. He took out paper and pen and began to write. "Dear Edward, I know you cannot read this, that these words come too late for any purpose but my own peace. But I need to write them nonetheless. I need to tell you that I forgive you, though there is perhaps nothing to forgive but the same pride and fear I myself possessed. I need to tell you that I'm sorry, that I wish we had found the courage to bridge the distance between us before death made it unbridgeable. I need to tell you that reading your letters has been both the most painful and most healing experience of my life. You were right that we let something precious slip away through our own stubbornness. But you were wrong to think it was entirely lost. The love between brothers doesn't die simply because it's not expressed. It persists, buried perhaps, dormant, but still alive. I feel it now, reading your words, walking the grounds we explored together, sitting in this house that holds so much of our shared history. I'm keeping Ashwood Hall. I'll make arrangements to manage both the estate and my London practice. I'll come here regularly. We'll care for the land as you did. We'll honour your memory by continuing what you built. And perhaps in doing so, I'll honour what we were to. Each other before pride divided us. Thank you for the letters. Thank you for reaching out even from beyond death. Thank you for reminding me that some bonds once forged can never truly break, only bend and wait for someone brave enough to straighten them again. Your brother, James. He folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, then slipped it into the box with Edward's letters to him. Perhaps someday, years from now, someone would find them both, and would understand the story they told together. Spring came early to Yorkshire that year. By March, snow had melted from the lower grounds, and the river ran high with meltwater. James had returned to London briefly to arrange his affairs, but found himself back at Ashwood Hall within a month, unable to stay away. He walked one morning to the family plot in the churchyard, where Edward had been buried in November. The stone was simple, bearing only his name and dates. James stood before it for a long time, the letter he had written in his hand. "I wish we could have had this conversation in life," he said quietly. "I wish I could see your face, hear your voice, embrace you as a brother should. But I'm grateful for what you left me, Edward. Grateful for your words, your honesty, your willingness to be vulnerable, even knowing you wouldn't be here to see how I responded. You gave me the gift of understanding and of forgiveness and of memory restored. Thank you." He placed the letter on the grave, weighing it down with a stone. The wind would likely take it, or rain would dissolve it, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the gesture, the saying of words that needed to be said. As he walked back to the house, he felt lighter somehow, as though a burden he had carried so long he'd forgotten its weight had finally been set down. The morning was bright, the air soft with the promise of spring, and Ashwood Hall stood solid and welcoming ahead of him. He would return to London, would maintain his practice, would continue his life there. But he would come back here too, regularly, would make this house a home again, would perhaps in time find the courage Edward never had to reach out to others, to build the connections and family that both brothers had denied themselves. The snow had melted, but the memory of those snowbound days would remain. The memory of sitting in Edward's study, reading his brother's words, feeling the walls of hurt and pride slowly crumbling. The memory of walking snow-covered grounds and understanding finally what had been lost and what could still be reclaimed. Not everything, of course. Edward himself could not be brought back, and that loss would always ache. But the love between them, the brotherhood that had seemed so broken, had been mended in an unexpected way. Through letters, through memory, through the simple act of reading and understanding, they had found their way back to each other. And that, James thought as he climbed the steps to the entrance, was a kind of miracle. A small miracle, perhaps, private and personal, but real nonetheless. The kind of miracle that happened when pride finally gave way to love, when fear surrendered to courage, when silence was broken by words that needed desperately to be spoken. Sleep gently, dear listener. May you find the courage to speak the words that need speaking, to mend the fences that need mending, before winter comes and makes all reconciliation impossible. May you know that love between family, between brothers and sisters, between parents and children does not die easily. It waits, patient as snow, for someone brave enough to tend it back to life. And may you understand that sometimes the deepest healing comes not in the words we exchange in life, but in the understanding we reach in the silence after. The snow has melted, but its lessons remain. The cold has passed, but the warmth found in that snowbound week endures. Sleep now and dream of reconciliation, of love that persists despite distance, of words that bridge even the gap between life and death. Good night.